Hey, sports card fans, it's John, Wade Boggs fan. Hope you're all doing well. With the National coming up next week, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to do an update on the Vintage 100 Index to give everyone a sense of a general look at where vintage card prices are, to give you maybe a little bit of information and knowledge going into the National. And today I have a very special guest. This all started with a partnership with Mike Baseball Collector, but I decided to have a guest on, a different guest for this episode here, and one that I think is perfect for an analysis of the Vintage 100 Index, and that is Graig Midlife Sports Cards. Graig, well, let's get him on here. There you are.
Hey. Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, glad to have you on. This is the first opportunity. I think this is the first time you've been on my show,
It
and
is.
really appreciate you having you on. I know we talked about this. I think I brought it up to you at Strongsville,
You did.
I think.
Yeah, you brought
And
up. Yeah, we had emailed about doing something together, and
yeah,
then at Strongsville, this is when that ball got rolling.
yeah. So I immediately thought of you in terms of a guest host, like who else could I have on that would be interested in this stuff? I know a lot of people out there say that they may not be interested in the value of their cards, at least for collectors. And honestly, I don't look up the value of any of my cards uh, unless it's my annual review and top 50 cards or whatever. I don't really pay much attention to the value of a card once I own it. Um, and so I thought in watching your videos, I know you have an analytical mind like I do, and I know some of your videos you delve into um, not necessarily, hey, these are cards you should buy or whatever, but you look at value purchases, stuff that you can buy for under $50 or different things like that. So I thought you'd be a good guest, and you looked at the information ahead of time. So it'll be interesting to see what questions you have as we look through the data. But to start off, for those of you who are a little unfamiliar of what this Vintage 100 Index is, it started about 2 years ago. Mike Baseball Collector did a video. I think it had to do with are certain vintage cards recession proof. And he went through a list of, I think he put together, it was 80 some vintage Hall of Fame rookie cards. And those are the ones that he looked at and made some comment of, man, it'd be really nice if someone could go back and pull all the pricing data for these cards and show trends and stuff. I'm like, I'm on it, because that I love analyzing data. And so I took that upon myself, and Mike was sort of the partner there, and we did different shows together and different updates. And so I expanded his 86, 87 rookie cards to 100 cards. So I added a few. And then since then, I've expanded on that. So we have the core Vintage 100 Index, which is primarily made of Hall of Fame rookie cards. Then I took it upon myself. I'm a glutton for punishment, I guess. I created 3 new indexes. One of them I call the Golden Age, which has 100 cards from the 40s and 50s, incorporating the cards from the 50s from the main Vintage 100 Index, and then adding about, it was like maybe 70 or so more for another 100 cards. Then I did one for the 60s, again, incorporating the few cards from the main Vintage 100 Index and adding a bunch of others. And then finally one for the 70s. And as you'll see at the end of our sort of analysis here, what I'm able to do is, for a lot of these players, maybe not their complete, say, tops run, but a lot of their cards are in various indexes. So I have the data. So I can create multiple other player indexes. And we have 3 that we're going to take a look at here toward the end. So are you ready to start the analysis of where the vintage card prices have been going?
I'm excited. I've seen all the episodes you did with Mike, and the fact that I'm here and get to participate, I'm very excited for.
Cool. All right. Well, let's start. Let's bring this up here on the screen. Now, the one thing to keep in mind is when we talk about dates. So this data for the Vintage 100 Index goes to the start of to January of 2019, all the way up through July of 2024. Now, we're still in July. So when I say the index for July, this is the last known sales date as of the end of June. So June 30th is July. All right. So to keep that in mind, so the January 2019 data was technically the last sale for a particular card from December of 2018. All right. And I don't do an average of every single sale. That would just have been way too much data to analyze. So I took the last sale of that month. And if there wasn't a sale in that particular month, then that value would carry over. So if there is a card in a particular grade that hasn't sold for 6 months, all right, that price for that card is constant for the last 6 months. All right. So let's take a look here. Let's see if I can get, there we go. All right. So for July 2024, the index, which is the total value of all the 100 cards divided by 100. And that's how you get the index. All right. So for looking at January of this year, the index was a revised, because there's always, I get data from VCP. And when you pull up the data, even though it may be 10 days, 2 weeks into the next month, sometimes when you look at the data, they find another data point and throw and throw it in their database. So every once in a while, I have to revise a price from the following month. So in January, the revised index was 1,071.68. The index for July 2024 was 1,141.18. So the index has gone up by about 6.5%. So those, on average, the 100 cards in that index has gone up by 6.5%. But if you look at it from a year ago, since July of 2023, it's down 5%. And we'll see it here in the graph format. Um, for those of you who have watched previous Vintage 100 indexes, when we first put this together, it was just, you could clearly see the COVID bubble, or whatever you want to call it, that happened in early 2021. Prices just went through the roof. People were spending all that stimulus money. They didn't have to go out to eat and all these other things. And so, like, hey, I'm going to spend some money on on baseball cards. And just the demand was out there, the money was out there, and prices went up, came back down. And then since 2022, and you'll see with these other indexes, it's sort of a trying to level off. And you can see though that for these vintage 100 cards, it has gone up since the start of the year. So, Craig, I don't want to dominate the conversation here, Greg. So let me get your initial thoughts on what you're seeing here in terms of the data.
Yeah, two things stuck out when I looked at this particular month, and I have to say that it and we might look at it later, but the spreadsheets that you've put together are incredible. So you are taking this insane amount of data, and you're now giving a very nice synopsis of what it says. But behind the scenes, there's just this huge amount of stuff happening to produce this. So um, for the people that are listening, that would be one thing to know: is it's far more complicated than he's making it seem.
Yeah.
That said, when I look at this data, two things really stick out. Number one, the second half of last year was awful, and the first half of this year has been much better.
Yeah.
Um, to go from for the first 6 months being negative to the last six, the most recent 6 months being not just leveling it, but also getting above that back to positive. It's pretty incredible how much things have gone up, at least with the cards in this index of the Vintage 100 index in the first 6 months. So that was my biggest takeaway from this first kind of set of data.
Yeah, because I it seems to be to me in the general consensus out there watching YouTube videos and just talking to other collectors, and seeing where maybe modern cards have been what they've been doing. It just seems over the last year people are more and more concerned of, hey, where, how far can prices go down and this, and maybe not doom and gloom. I haven't been seeing too many doom and gloom type of videos out there, and if anything it may be different segments of maybe modern or ultra modern cards. Vintage has always been that, I like to call it granny stock for those who are investors. Those blue chip stocks that can weather recessions and just downturns in the economy and still sort of hang in there. And then when times are good, they go up, but they're not like tech stocks that'll just go up like Nvidia. Um, and so that's how I always viewed uh, vintage cards, and you could see that where at least in 2023, where there seemed to be that sentiment of, all right, where's the bottom going to be? How low are we going to get back to pre-pandemic prices and all this stuff? That if you're looking at the chart here, yeah, there was some softening definitely in 2023,
Mhm.
but now it seems that I don't know if I want to say we hit another low, because we're in past episodes, Mike and I have always wondered, okay, what's the new normal now? And it seemed like these indexes and the vintage cards were trying to find that new normal, that new bottom to then grow from. So I'm wondering, it'll be interesting to see. I may not do another update for like another 6 months because it doesn't make sense to do this on a monthly basis. We'll see how 2024 is. And maybe it is that sort of semi rebounding year from the last 2 years. Maybe we found a bottom at the end of 2023. It'll be interesting to see.
The two things that I wanted to throw out there, you've talked about it on previous episodes. You've not yet mentioned it on this one, but when you find the data points, do you want to share with people what grade you're finding the data points from for the different cards?
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that is a big component of this index. Um, when I put together, obviously, you have to be consistent in terms of what you're looking at. So what I went with the model, and I know some people don't quite like this terminology, but I went with collector grade. Now, basically, if it's a card from the 40s, I look at a PSA 4 value of that card. If it's from the 50s, it's a PSA 5 value, 60s, PSA 6, 70s, PSA 7.
Hmm.
So that's the data point that I look at. So a um, now in this index, I don't have, because of the sort of the huge outlier that it may present, especially when I throw in with cards from the 70s. I don't have the 52 tops Mickey Mantle in the vintage 100 index. He's in the golden, and I'll explain that when we get to that. But so for 1952 tops Mickey Mantle, say it would be a PSA 5 value, and I would look up that price in the VCP database, take the sale for a particular, or the last sale of a particular month, and that's what I would put into the spreadsheet.
Now, the other thing that I think that we have to at least acknowledge along the way is, it's not just the sports card economy, right? It's the overall economy. And one of the things a lot of people ask me at the end of the year, because I do like a Q&A thing at times, and people are like, what do you think 2024 is going to look like? And one of the things I kept saying was, I think it'll do better than people are expecting. And part of the reason is because it's an election year. And whenever it's an election year, um, things are flatter in the economy or a little rosier in the economy than they might otherwise be because it's an election year, and who the people that are in office have some things that they can do to help alleviate some of the economic pressures. So it's not unusual that in an election year there might be a little bit of a bump in the stock market or a little bit of
Hmm.
bump in some of the spending that creates things in the economy. So I do think this year is interesting that it has kind of bounced up in this index. And I wonder, I think next year will be even more important to see because it won't be an election year. And then again, based on who's elected, there's a whole different set of policies that will be enacted that could affect things too. But,
Yeah.
people's disposable income is a huge part of this because
Yeah.
you're not going to miss your rent check in order to buy a baseball card.
At
Well,
least I
most
hope not.
people wouldn't. Yeah, most people wouldn't.
Yeah.
And so inflationary pressures and things are all part of that. And that we could go down a whole rabbit hole with that. But I do think that should at least be acknowledged that we are in an election year, which does matter for all things economic.
Yes, and I don't use it very often, but I did major in economics in college. So if you look back at the data here in 2023, that's when inflation started really going crazy, and it's back down. It's still tough for people, right? But the 9, 10 double digit inflation months have ebbed down. We're down. I think the latest data was like 3%, which is still not great, but a lot better than I think when it was in 2023. And maybe, again, not getting too much into general economics here, but things were pretty tough in 2023. There's maybe some people who said, hey, you know what? I need to cut back on my card purchases because rent's going up or gas is going up and I commute and this and all whatever, grocery bills. So there may have been a little bit of tightening on hobby budgets, which goes into supply and demand and all that stuff. And
Yeah.
maybe that was the one of the contributing factors in 2023. And with things easing a little bit, election year, maybe um, a feeling of that things are going to be getting better, maybe because of the election or whatever. Maybe you're opening up your wallet a little bit and maybe spending more on cards, like we saw in Extreme back in 2021.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah,
totally agree.
yeah. All right. So what I did initially was I took this vintage 100 index and then I looked within those 100 cards and said, well, what's the trend for those particular cards? There was maybe on average, there's maybe 27, 28, maybe 29 cards from the 50s. And Mike and I analyzed that. Well, you're going from 100 cards to even a smaller sample size. So
Hmm.
this is where I got into and decided to do a whole other set of indexes. So in all, I'm probably, at least on a monthly basis, having to update. It's probably over 300 cards and looking up data for 300 cards and putting them in the spreadsheets. Speaking of the spreadsheets, in the description of this video, I will put all these spreadsheets on Google Docs, and I will have a link. So if you do want to see some of the behind the scenes data, I'll have links so you can check them out. You can check out what specific cards make up each of the indexes, because that matters as well. Like what cards are we looking at? I tried to get a general sense of the more popular cards for a particular, say, decade. And you may disagree with some of the ones that I've chosen over maybe other players, but hey, I'm doing the index, so it's my choice.
Right.
So this is the second full index that I did, and this is the golden age. So this is cards from the 1940s and 50s, going back to the 40, 41, 1940, 41 play balls into the Bowmans and then tops and stuff like that through the 50s. So for this golden age index, at the beginning of this year, it was 2,590. And then for July, we're at 2,584. Pretty much. Now, you'll see in the graph here, there's movement every month, but man, for 6 months, it's been flat.
Yeah.
If you go back a year from now, July of 2023, though, down 12%. So let's take a look at the graph here. And you can see starting in 20. Okay. Not sure what
You
happened there with the
you
screen, but
broke up for just a second.
okay. All right. Yeah, I don't know what happened in that would be June. You can see a little bump up in the index there. I do have the 52 tops Mickey Mantle in this index. All right. But if I had put that card in at a PSA 5, it would just dominate, completely dominate where the index would go. So I took a look at a PSA 1 of the 52 tops Mickey Mantle. Everything else follows the collector's grade, but the Mickey Mantle is in a PSA 1. That way it doesn't, it in some sense it still dominates, but not as much.
Mhm.
So what are
I
your
would,
thoughts here?
yeah, my first reaction would be you said, I don't know what happened in June. I do. Willie Mays died. And when Willie Mays died, I think a lot of people went and bought some Willie Mays stuff and there was a temporary spike. So I think that might be a contributing factor. I know you have better data on Mays, but I think that could be part of it. I think also, summer started, people had a little bit more, they went from, you know, uh, a lot of people, whether it be younger people that collect, they're in school or educators, or a lot of things revolve around the typical school year, and that's when it ended. I think those things all could be contributing factors.
Mhm.
The thing that is the most interesting for me on this particular chart is not that little bump, it's how flat things have been other than that bump from about October till now.
Yeah.
So a lot of people are like, doom and gloom. Things are going to keep going down. It's a slow decline. It's over,
Yeah.
and it's like, man, it looks pretty flat to me, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, to be fair, I think this index may have to wait a little bit to see if there's any effect by Willie Mays, because again, the July data here is for actual June 30th.
Hmm.
So the June data would be May. So that little bump up was technically before Willie Mays passed away.
Okay.
So it's a little confusing. I didn't
No,
want
no,
to
no, that makes
make it
sense.
June because it'd be end of June. So again, when we say July, in theory, a price could be June 30th.
Hmm.
Okay. So you have to look, it's data from like the previous month.
And
But
and
yeah,
and needless to say, it is a jump, but it's not a massive jump.
no.
That's a little bump. It's still still a pretty flat movement. So I don't think it's anything to get all worked up about.
Yeah.
Again, to me, it's the flatness of
The general, yeah. The trend.
8 or 9 months in a row, with one, probably a couple of outlier sales that maybe created that little bump, but
Mhm.
that's really flat and that's really interesting to
Yeah.
me. And that's my takeaway from this particular one. I mean, if you look back at 2019 and 2020, it's the same sort of thing. It's
Mhm.
very, very consistent before it starts jumping around.
Yeah. Now, one thing I do wanna point out, and this really only affects the the cards from the 50s in the vintage 100 index, the main index, and this golden age index, is that for some of the cards, um, the there's there aren't a lot of turnover or sales in that particular grade. So if we're looking at a card from the early 50s, um, say I think I have in there, I'm trying to think of one example. Um, I this may not be wrong, but it's the only one that popped into my head. The 52, I think it's the 51 Bowman Roy Campanella, for example, in a PSA 5. Right. There may not have been a PSA 5 sale for 4 months.
Hmm.
So that data point doesn't change, doesn't go up, doesn't go down. If it's a $500 card in the index, it's $500 for 6 straight months. So some of the flatness, I think, through this golden age index could be the result of some cards just not having many sales in that particular grade. So I do have to give that as a caveat, as some of the behind the scenes stuff that's going on that you can't see on the graph here. But as I'm entering data, I'm like, okay, well, there's another month where that particular card in that grade one didn't sell. So I just carry on the price from the previous month.
The other thing I would throw out there is, when I look at this, there's obviously the wild jump in there. But where we were before COVID, right, in normal times, uh, it was at about 1,200
Hmm.
consistently with a slight increase over time.
Hmm.
And if you look now for the last, 2 years post COVID, it's been at 2,600. It's more than double where it was in 2019. Even after this crash, we say, "Oh, there was a crash." There was a
Yep.
crash. There was a crash from this fictitious house of cards,
Hmm.
but it's still more than double where it was before all that happened. So even if things are on a little bit of a downward trend still, even if things drop a little bit,
Yeah.
it still has a ton of room above where it was. Now,
Yep.
part of that, again, we could get into the weeds on, well, the dollar isn't worth as much. And so it's inflation, it's not inflation adjusted. And it could be some of those things, but it's still double what it was before COVID, more than
Yep.
double.
Yep. And the as you can see here for the golden age, it wasn't much of a there was that initial crash, but then look, it went back up. Now, maybe not back up to the height of what was that, maybe February or April of 2021,
Mhm.
but it went down, but then it started to go back up again. And then it's been on a maybe slow decline or leveling off. So again, the data shows like, okay, well, maybe we're at this new, I don't want to call it like, again, that new normal, a pre-COVID level. And then that may last for a couple years, and then something's going to affect positive or negative, and maybe it'll go down significantly or up significantly to another new normal.
Mhm.
And as you can see, the trend line from 2019, I mean, the trend, like you said, it's gone from like 1,200 to 2,600. And that trend line over the close to 5.5 years has been positive. It's been growing. Now,
Mhm.
in between, there's been some heartburn, like, oh my gosh, prices are too expensive. I'm getting priced out of the market in early 2021 to, oh, okay, now they're becoming a little bit more affordable. I can start buying some now. Um, so, yeah.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay. Well, let's take a look at the next index, which is cards from the 1960s. And as you can see, the average price has gone dramatically down. So we were at like 2,500 for the golden age index. So those cards are in there. There's a lot of comma cards in that golden age index. Now we're into some cards that are, I think, for the normal collector, a lot more affordable. The average card for a January 2024 was 332.78. In July, 309.58. So about 7% drop. If you
Mhm.
look at where it was from last year at this time, it's about 11% drop. So it's a continuation of the end of 2023 into 2024, and we can see that here. And there's been some fluctuations, and it's probably due to maybe half a dozen, 10 cards, 12 cards maybe in a given month, maybe had a couple spikes in sales. The other thing that this chart and maybe even the data itself doesn't pick up, and I think it's important to note, is for every PSA 5, or it would be technically a PSA 6 Nolan Ryan rookie card from 1968 tops. Not all PSA 6s are equal.
Right.
You have some that have better eye appeal. You have some that are off center, but the technical grade is still 6. So you could have a 6 And I don't factor into, well, this was a nicer copy, so I'm going to somehow, uh, you know, manipulate the data. I don't do any data manipulation. um, it's just it's wherever the sale is, and also buy it now is sometimes different than auction, and all of those are included.
Hmm.
Um, so when you get some of these spikes, it could very well be that maybe some high end PSA sixes, because we're talking about the 60s index here, maybe some really nice copies sold for a premium versus the previous month. And so you get a spike, and then the next sale may not be as nice and it sells for less. It's the same PSA 6, but that's another thing that this data doesn't take into account the eye
It does.
appeal of the card.
It doesn't take into account, and that's one of the biggest criticisms I get whenever I do any sort of data video. They go, "Oh, then not all fives are the same or sixes are the same," but over the law of averages, it kind of works itself out. There's probably a really nice, Nolan Ryan rookie that sold 1 month, and maybe there's kind of a bad eye appeal, Tom Seaver rookie that sold. And so if you're dealing with one card, then it makes a big difference. But when you're dealing with, 20, 30, 40 cards in an index or in the index of the 100 cards, I feel like that just kind of balances itself out. And so the data is obviously not perfect. There's no such thing as perfect data.
Yeah.
But what data does do is it gives you a little bit of a glimpse of what's happening. And when you look at over an extended period of time, I mean, an extended period of time, I think anybody just anecdotally would say this is kind of what's been happening. So to me, that shows the reliability of the data. Is it perfect? No. But does it do a pretty darn good job of showing you what's going on visually? Absolutely.
Yeah. And that, but again, I think it's also fair to recognize what some of the, the behind the scenes, hey, this isn't perfect and here's why it may not be perfect. But like you said, the I think the trend is more important. You can stream down to the data level and say, oh, well, this is why this and this. Well, okay, maybe for a particular month, yes, this is why the index went up or down 2% because of these couple cards. But let's look at the overall trend. And I think with 5.5 years of data, you can get a pretty good sense of where things at least have been and extrapolate that to maybe where the next 6 months are going to go.
Yeah, it's an average of the averages
Yep.
instead of just an average. And I totally agree with you about the trend. And again, I'll keep pointing this out because this is one of my big takeaways is the index for the 60s is at about 300, just above it. And, in 2019, before any of this happened, it was right about 150. So again, it's double where it was. So doom and gloom, is it all going to go down to zero again? I mean, it's still way above where it was. If you bought a bunch of stuff in 2019,
Oh
you
yeah.
aren't killing it like you did in 2021, 22, but you're still doing really well.
Yep. And and I think if you look at a lot of long time collectors, and I hate to always bring it up, but Mike Baseball Collector, he's been collecting vintage cards for probably 10 plus years. I know Chris from Missouri has been collecting vintage for a long period of time. And you look at their collections and you go, oh my gosh, look at all those, I don't know, necessarily high grade cards, but decent grade cards. And you're thinking, wow, well, they may have bought a lot of them in 2017, 2018, 2019. For me, I decided to jump into and start my vintage collection. Guess when? Early 2021.
Right.
So, have I bought cards that today are worth less? Most likely,
Yeah.
but that doesn't bother me because it's not about the value.
Yeah.
It's about being able to say, hey, I have this particular card. But yeah, I got in at just it may have actually been toward the end of 2020, but anyway, it was before. I did not time things well.
Right. And I think the best example of what you're describing is actually Orlando, because Orlando, he's got so many 5-digit cards in his
Yeah.
collection and so many high grade, way pre-war turn of the century cards, and he's just like, I could never afford this stuff now.
Yeah.
It was just, it's a labor of love over a long, long time. And what a lot of us that, a lot of people that are just coming back into the hobby or new to the hobby are like, I'll never be able to catch up to those guys. And you're like, well, you won't in 3 years,
No.
but you might in 30.
Yeah.
And you have to treat it like a marathon and not a sprint. And because that's what
Absolutely.
it is. It's a lifelong journey, not a short one, hopefully.
Yeah. Yeah. I hope I have many, many, many years of collecting, and where others' collections may consist of several thousand vintage cards. I'm still I'm approaching 500. So, it's like, yeah, I'll get there. I may not get all the ones that I would love to have in my lifetime, but I'm enjoying the journey. So
Yeah.
that's all that counts.
Yeah.
All right. Anything else for the 1960s here?
No.
All right. Let's get into the 70s here. So again, you can see the index is going smaller and smaller just because 70s cards in general are not worth as much as 60s and is not worth as much as 50s. So for the January 70s index, we're looking at 138.41. In July, 129.41. So, we're a $9 on average difference, but it's a 6.5 percent decline. And since July of last year, it's a little over 4.5% decline. Now, I did make a note here, and just like the stock market, on occasion, maybe not so much the Dow, but I know on Nasdaq, if there's a company that's not doing well, they may get replaced and removed from the index, and another company brought in. And that's what I decided to do after. I can't remember whether it was the last video I did, maybe in the last video I did with Mike Baseball Collector. Um, I I had in there the 1975 tops 57 MVPs, which featured Hank Aaron and Mickey Mantle. I thought, well, that's a card with two Hall of Famers from the 70s. But he said, hey, what about that 1971 tops Dusty Baker, Don Baylor short print rookie card? That's a really tough card to get, especially now we're talking PSA 7 values here. A 71 tops and a 7 in itself is sometimes hard to get. But two, you're talking about a high number short print. And Don Baylor, or is it, no, I'm sorry, it's Dusty Baker that may end up getting into the Hall of Fame as a manager.
Oh, he'll get in
Um,
for sure. Yeah.
yeah. So I think there's some interest in that card. And so I decided to take out that 75 uh, the MVP card of Aaron and Mantle, took it completely out of the index all the way back to 2019, and added the 71 tops Dusty Baker, Don Baylor short print rookie card. Again, all the way back from 2019, I added that data. So I did a complete switch. So again, we have that trend. I didn't want to necessarily do it like as the start of January, and then suddenly the index starts going up, because I think
You'd
that,
have to weight it or something. Yeah.
yeah, and I was like, let's just completely take one out and completely put one in. So this is what the chart looks like here. Um, Again, you can see some similar trends with the other decades, but for the 70s, I'll leave my comments out. I'll wait to hear what you have to say here.
Yeah, one of my biggest takeaways from the whole exercise when I was looking at the raw data and the charts is that the 70s seem to have held up a little bit better than some of the others. And I mean, we can all hypothesize on why that might be. I think part of the reason, this is just a guess, is a lot of us that have, gotten back in a lot deeper, or a lot of people have re-entered the hobby, grew up in that time, and so they're buying a lot of nostalgia cards. They're buying a lot of the cards that when they were a kid they couldn't afford, the George Brett rookie or the Robin Yount rookie or the, some of these early 70s cards that were big cards, even a Dave Winfield rookie, stuff like that, and Ozzie Smith. And I think that some nostalgia buying has been happening potentially. Maybe you're an Orioles fan. You always wanted an Eddie Murray rookie card, but you couldn't get it. And now you're like, I make money. I can go buy that. So I think that there's been potentially more people involved in the 70s than there had been previously, and that's my guess as to why. It's like the baby boomers kids, the baby boomers are collecting cards from the mid to late 50s, early
Mhm.
60s, and the baby boomers kids are like, the late 70s, early 80s is kind of our nostalgia period. So
Yep.
that's kind of my guess.
Yeah.
But I definitely did notice, in some of the other data that you pulled and some of the data that I just penciled out myself, the 70s seemed to do fairly well comparatively.
Yep. Yep. My thought, and it doesn't necessarily contradict what your hypothesis is, but to me, especially in that 2021, 2022 period and beyond, you don't see you see a spike, but it's not a huge spike and then a correction and then going this way and that way and stuff. It's that general increase, all right? And I think when all the money flooded into the baseball card, I'm going to say hobby. I hate using the word market, but hobby with COVID, I think a lot of money went to I hate to use the word investments. They wanted the Mickey Mantles, the Hank Aaron's, the key rookie cards, the cards that they thought would, or maybe cards that they have always wanted but just could never afford. And hey, here's this money. I want to buy a 1952 Willie Mays because I never had the opportunity to. It was always out of my reach. But now I have
Yeah.
this money. I want to go buy one. So, or hey, these are like some blue chip, these 50s cards, maybe some in the 60s are more blue chip and have more potential of going up. So I want to start buying them. In the 70s, I think sort of just it never had that, investment or key card feeling like the cards from the 50s and maybe some into the 60s. But I think to your point, there was still interest in the 70s, and that's why I don't think you saw the bubble. There wasn't a big rush to go out with stimulus money and buy 70s cards.
Yeah. I
There
think
there was
I
an interest there. I think I think you have a valid point
yeah.
that with all the money out there, they're like, hey, I can now afford this Eddie Murray rookie card, but hey, I also want to pick up a blue chip 50s card.
Hmm.
All right. And I think all the big money went into the 50s and maybe 60s. The growing interest and extra money went into the 70s. And that's why I think you saw the general rise. So, yeah.
I think that's a great point, and I think as we move forward, what you're describing in the 70s is part of what I think was not happening with Willie Mays, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But when you look at like the housing bubble and the housing crash, there were some areas there wasn't really a housing crash during the housing bubble because they
Central
didn't,
Pennsylvania. Yeah.
yeah, they didn't get run way up. But some of the areas, like areas of Arizona, areas of California,
Florida.
some of the, yeah, or where things went way up and the bubble got way too carried away, that when the correction happened, there was more correction that needed to occur. And I think that's what you're describing. And I think that's a really good point. I think the spike being not as high, in modern basketball cards, if you look at Kevin Durant cards, there's some of the cards that went spiked the sharpest and the highest. And there's some of the cards that have come down the most because they had so much further to fall when they fell because of how high they got. But
Yep.
some of the guys who didn't spike, like a Pete Maravich, as high, aren't going to come down as much because they didn't result. The result wasn't the same, and I think that's a
Exactly.
great point for sure.
Yeah. 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 So you alluded to Willie Mays. And so what I did beyond this is again, not now this is just a case of just doing some cutting and pasting. I have all this data now. And so for certain players, depending on when their career started and ended, there are quite a few that within these different indexes, I may have, if not every single tops, maybe even Bowman card of theirs, the majority of maybe their playing days cards. So I can pull that data out and do individual player indexes. And so the first one I did, of course, you have to look at Mickey Mantle, um, biggest sort of name in the hobby, at least from the 50s and into the 60s. And so I took 30 cards that were either part of the Golden Age index or the 1960s index. And I'm trying to think if there was a playing days card from either Bowman or Topps that was missing, and I don't think so. And 30 cards, there are a couple all-star cards that are in the indexes, and multiplayer cards. I threw them in there as well. Anything with Mickey Mantle on it within these indexes, I included. So there's 30 cards. It's a smaller sample, but the index for January was 3,083, and then for July, 3,065, down, basically flat from a percentage basis. From a year ago, just under 5% drop. So let's look at the craziness here for the Mickey. Now, some of this may have to be again that PSA 152 Topps card, his 51 Bowman. Obviously, it's a big dollar card, and you get fluctuations in a PSA 5 sale. Again, it would be a PSA 551 Bowman. Some of his earlier Topps cards, you could get one that again sells for a lot higher a given month, and then one maybe not as better eye appeal. So I wasn't surprised when I put this data together that there was such, especially since 2021, such volatility. But if you look at the last 12 months, not
Mm-hmm.
so much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That month there, February, March of 2021 was
Yeah.
insane. That things went from about 23 to 43. I
Yeah.
mean, it almost doubled. We should see when did stimulus checks start going out? I mean, is that when they went out? Like, did everybody buy a mantle? Because that 1 month is absolutely insane.
Yeah.
Similarly, what it's about November or so of
Yep.
2022, it took a huge dive. But like you said, because they're not weighted, that could be a huge jump. Maybe 151 Bowman Mantle sold for a record price of $5,000 more
Yep.
than it usually had, and that's the reason for it. Like
Yep.
it's hard to know, but
Yeah.
we can assume. But again, it gives us a gauge. But then again, I look at where are we now compared to where were we 5 years ago? I'm going to be a broken record.
Yeah.
We're more than double where we were. So there's that, it's like as a teacher, I teach about the stock market and investing and stocks, and my students will say, isn't buying stocks, isn't that like playing a slot machine? And I go, well, it kind of depends. It depends. Are you buying one stock? You buying a mutual fund? And are you buying it for 2 months or are you buying it for 20 years? Because
Hmm.
when you zoom out like this over 5 years,
Yep.
like those bumps in there, that spike, those little spikes in there, they're crazy, but they're not as crazy as it looked when you narrowed it down to like a 3 month period. And
Yep.
it's just crazy. So it's not the same. You have to look at long-term trends. You can't just look at this month to next month and then
Hmm.
think you know what's happening. You have to have lots of data points, and the more data points the better. And that's why all of your hard work on this makes it so interesting, because we can see a good 2 years before the spike.
Yep.
Now we can see a good year and a half at least since really the leveling out. And then the
Hmm.
stuff in between, we have to kind of roll our eyes at. It's almost like if we just eliminated
Exactly.
from
Yeah.
January 2021 to December of 2023, and then you just connected it. That
Yep.
would almost, you have to kind of throw those 2 years out, And then you say, what are things like? And that's why I keep talking about what is it now compared to before,
Yeah.
because that's really the interesting part. If things had corrected all the way back to where they were,
Yeah. If it was a bell
then
curve, yeah.
yeah, then that would be a completely different story, but it's not a bell curve. The new floor seems to be about double where it was. That I mean, every
Yep.
time it gets much below on this chart, about
Yep.
3,000, it goes
Yep.
back up. It keeps
Yeah.
staying right above a 3,000. And that's where there's that they have all these terms for this in
Yeah.
the stock market,
Yep.
that's where there's some resistance. The
Yep.
resistance is at about 3,000. And as soon as it gets below 3,000, it's like, oh, this is getting cheap. And people start to get back in. So
Yep.
that kind of tends to tell me something at least. But yeah, the craziness in the middle is just craziness because we were dealing with monopoly money. It wasn't real money.
Yeah. Yep. And again, this index here is only 30 cards. So it's
Mhm,
the average price of 30. So
mhm,
the higher price mantle cards weigh heavier in
mhm,
this index, and you don't have as many data points to average out. So
mhm.
again, but I think it still tells a story. But
Yeah,
you have to take a look at some of the volatility, especially in those two middle years, could be because maybe a small handful of cards just went crazy.
yeah.
So let's the other player, and we had talked about him earlier, was Willie Mays. Now, again, the data for July would be cards sold through June 30th. So I think the next video that I do and next set of
Yeah.
data, I think would be very telling to see where Willie Mays cards have gone. So I don't think we can glean too much of this from his passing. But in January, it was 1557. July now it's 1422, actually down a little over 8.5% since last year, down 32%. Now I took
Mhm.
28 cards, so Mantle had 30. There's 28 cards for Willie Mays, and yes, it's this is an interesting one. I To your
Yeah.
point, this was now if you take the trend line, we were at 500 in 2019, 2020, and we're at 1500, so it's a tripling.
Mhm,
Still that general trend line,
mhm.
but if you look at 2023, I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Well, I this is the one where the housing bubble analogy was in my head is yeah, the reason it's down 33% over the last year is I think he got run up too much. He went from 500 up to well over 2,000. He was
Yeah.
4x plus
Yep.
and the other guys were more like 3x
Mhm.
and he was 4x plus and now he's at 3x
Yep.
plus.
I think
So
I have a theory as to why, but
yeah, I want to hear. I'd love to hear what you
my
think.
my
But
my theory is I think there's a general consensus within the hobby that to some extent Mickey Mantle cards may be overpriced and Willie Mays has been tragically undervalued. But when you look at the two, either the players, the they're both in the same time frame of baseball cards, that Willie Mays cards compared to Mickey Mantle, there was such a gap, and they're like, how can these Willie Mays cards be so cheap compared to Mickey Mantle? And I think people maybe in that 21, 22 time frame started saying, hey, you know what? These are undervalued cards. I'm going to start buying Willie Mays cards. And I think there's been also, and you hate to say it, but with Willie Mays' age, I think there was a sense of I better start buying Willie Mays because I don't know how long, now may be the time
yeah,
over the last 3 years, now may be the
a
time to
FOMO
buy
thing.
Willie Mays cards.
Yeah,
And so I think there was a sense of there's too much of a gap between Mays and Mantle. And people saw some opportunities of, hey, I need to buy some Willie Mays cards, which of course I didn't do. But hey, and I think that may have led to some of his cards jumping up compared to other players. Because like, what is it about Willie Mays than Mickey Mantle or the next one we'll have is Hank Aaron? I think it's that sense that Willie Mays has always been the stepchild to Mickey Mantle, and I
mhm,
think people saw some opportunity there.
yeah. I think that's a good point. Um, I think I think that it still uh, is, like we said, 3 times what it was. So the gap maybe did close some, but maybe people got a little carried away with it. Um, yeah, it's super interesting, this one. This was like I even put on my notes when I had taken some notes. I said, "What's up with Maze?" Like, was one of my key takeaways, is like, what's going on? And we don't know, but we can guess. And I think also there's something to be said for Mantle. For a lot of people, is unaffordable. So if Mantle's unaffordable and you're going, I want to buy some late 50s cards of some of the all time greats, but I can't afford a Mantle. Well, what's your next best option? Your next best option is Maze, right?
Yep.
And
Yep.
so a lot of people are going to go Maze because it's in their price point, and he's a likable guy. I know I'm a little bit living in Northern California. Maze is everything up here.
Hmm.
And so every card show I go to, there's a Maze premium, there's Maze in every case. So it's hard for me to know what's happening in the rest of the country because it's Maze mania up here.
Hmm.
So it makes it hard for me to not, have all these prejudices as to why that would be. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's still way up. He's still way up.
Yep. Yeah. All right, so let's take a look at the last player here. I don't want to have this the video too long here, but I think it's good to look at the other, like the third sort of leg to the stool. Of course, is Hank Aaron. Yeah. So when
Mhm.
you think of like from the 50s and even into the 60s, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Hank Aaron. So the Hank Aaron was at almost 440 back in January of this year, and now it's at 420. So about 19, $20 per card on average, um, for a drop of about 4.5% since a year ago. It's down almost 14%. Now this one had 27 cards from, again, just like Willie Mays, three indexes, because you have the golden age from the 50s, 60s, and then they had a few cards into the 70s. So let's look at, now this is the smallest index. So the smallest sample size, there's only 27 that were in there for Hank Aaron. And another, I would say, at least interesting from an analysis standpoint of the Hank Aaron index.
Yeah, I mean, so he went from 4 times what he was, or just under 4 times, 3.5, and now he's 2 times where he was. So, people say Mays. I mean, we just said it. Mays cards are way down in the last year. They are way down, but Mays cards are still 3 times what they were. And Hank Aaron is down in the last year, but Hank Aaron's 2 times what he was.
Hmm.
The other thing about Aaron that's a little bit different than the other two guys that I think is at least worth noting is his rookie card is so much more expensive than all of his other cards,
Yep.
that that one card is going to dictate a lot of what his value is for this index.
Hmm.
Whereas Mays, he's got a lot of really expensive cards, and Mantle has a lot of really expensive cards. A second year Hank Aaron is criminally undervalued,
Yeah.
compared
Yep.
to his rookie card. So the weighting here is this is almost an index, I would guess, on what his rookie card has been doing,
Yeah.
versus the other guys. They have several big cards.
Yeah, it would have been interesting, and you make a very good point. Would be interesting to sort of overlay just his 52 or 54 tops rookie and see how, because I would I would venture to say the spike in early 2021 is people saying I can finally afford a Hank Aaron rookie card. And it's probably solely driven, like, or maybe not so, but heavily driven by his rookie card,
Hmm.
and the jump up in the price of his rookie card in the fall. And but also in general, I think Hank Aaron is obviously in the hobby, has, will always have a following. But it's, I don't think as strong as Mantle or even Mays.
Hmm.
He's one of the greatest players ever,
Hmm.
but some of his cards that they're I mean, given the grade, they're not that expensive
Yeah.
for how great Hank Aaron was, and I don't know why. But I think that tends to seeing this general flatness. I mean, again, it's gone from relatively 200 to 400, so a doubling. Okay,
Hmm.
we've seen other doublings, but if you look how low he started off, around the 200, and he's only 400 on average, and that includes his rookie card. Because
Well,
remember,
part
this
of
is the
it is he
yeah,
came in 3 years after. So part of it is the age of the card. So older
yeah,
cards are usually worth more because
that's
they're
true. A
rarer.
few more 70s. You're absolutely
He's
right.
got some
Yep,
more 70s. And but if you look at like after about 58, if you get into like a 59 Hank Aaron, it's very, very affordable. I mean, the
yes,
58's still going to be a few hundred. But
yep,
59, and then he's got 15 straight cards
yeah,
that are going to be pretty darn affordable.
yep,
But Willie Mays, I mean, Mickey Mantle's the big man on campus. He's the homecoming king or whatever,
yep,
right? And then you've got Willie Mays, who people consider the best of all time all around.
yep,
And that leaves him as third billing. And it's sad that he doesn't get, to be third billing. I mean, to
yeah,
play at a time, imagine that. It's like, there's a lot of sports like this, like tennis recently. There were like three of the all-time bests and happened to be playing at the exact same time. And if one of them was playing and the other two weren't around at that time, they would have won
yep,
50 titles instead of 25 or whatever they won. And
yeah,
so it's just interesting how, because he played when he played, which happened to be during those guys' era, he doesn't probably get what he deserves.
yeah, yep. And one other thing just struck me, and I don't think it plays a big part in either uh, Mantle or Aaron's, but I know for Mays, he has a couple cards, at least one that I can think. And I'm trying to remember the year. Was it 66, where he's card number one in the set?
Hmm.
That's important. I think Willie Mays also may have a couple, if they're not um, high series short prints, they're up there. So whether we're talking Hank Aaron, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, or some other players in these indexes, the fact that they may be the first card, the last card in the set, those are always condition sensitive. You may have some players' cards in a particular year being the high series or short prints, harder to find. All those little things just play in the background here. And I don't think I can't recall whether Hank Aaron has any high number short print cards from those different years. I don't think he was ever card number. Well, he was for 74. He was or was it 76? He was card number one because of the for the home run. I think 74, the home run king. That may be
Hmm.
card number one, but
Hmm.
um, it's a 70s card. So again, it's not that hard to find good copies. So all those small little things play in the background here with all this data. Uh, eye appeal for some of these vintage cards. Um, how rare the card may be. You get certain cards that a Willie Mays and Hank Aaron had 71 tops cards. Mickey Mantle didn't.
Well, another
Um,
another
it's
one, just
just
again, we
yeah,
could go down
yeah,
rabbit holes, but Mantle and Mays were famous really early, and their teams were playing for World Series. And one of the things that made Hank Aaron so famous is how consistent he was for so long.
yeah,
So toward the end of his career, it's like, man, look at what he's accumulated, kind of quietly
yeah,
accumulated by hitting 35 home runs every year. And now, 15 years in, he's going to catch Babe Ruth. And then he starts getting kind of famous. Well, why does that matter? Not that he wasn't famous. Don't get me wrong. Of course, he was very good. Of course, he was famous, but not like Mantle and Mays famous. So, why does that matter? It matters because kids back then were handling pinning the cards up of the superstars. You'd pull that pack, and that's the one that was on the top with the rubber band on it. So, the
yep,
pop report for high grade of some of these guys, the ones that got most trashed were the first and last card, but also the
Yep.
most famous players on the most famous teams.
Yep.
And Hank Aaron wasn't the major market. Hank Aaron was about being really good for a really long time instead of the absolute superstar. So I think that the population could be a little bit affect some of the
Yep.
values as well.
Yeah, and that's another thing that this index has just cannot factor in is population counts for a particular grade. There may be some that are, like you said, harder to grade because they're card number one or a high number short print or whatever. And when you try to compare it to another player's card, even in the same set, it may be harder for one card, or just take a look at the Ozzie Smith card or the 76 George Brett. Like if a card was on a certain place on the printing sheet, a well-centered copy just could be extremely hard to find for that particular player based on where they were on the sheet.
Hmm.
So that may play a factor in, because again, these are graded copies. I'm looking at graded copies. These aren't ungraded prices that I'm looking at. So there's a whole bunch of stuff working within this that you can, pull apart and try to analyze. But again, I think in general, this data here, knowing its weaknesses but some strengths, showing general timeline stuff, just I, I love doing this, as you can tell, and I know
Oh yeah, yeah.
you do too. So
Yeah, I mean, I've watched you guys talk about your data for a long time, and I always sat and watched and go, "Man, I wish I could be in that
yeah,
conversation." And then you asked me to join, and I was like, "Heck yeah, I've been wanting to do this for 2 years with you." So
yeah.
yeah, I'm in.
Excellent. Well, that's all of the sort of charts and data and graph like that. Maybe if we have a couple minutes left, if there's anything else you want to bring, ask or take a look at or things like that with all the data.
I don't think so. I think that we did a pretty good job. Again, I would encourage people out there to take a second and go down to your description and actually look at the spreadsheets. If you're a
Yeah.
data person at all, I think I think at the very least you would get a much greater appreciation to all that John has put into this
A
because
labor of love.
it is pretty incredible the amount of data that you've compiled. And again, like you said, it's not perfect, but it sure as heck is better than what anybody else has, which is just anecdotal thoughts. It
Yeah.
gives you some actual finite numbers to look at and come up with at least some observations. And I think that it's pretty fantastic. My biggest takeaways I think are most of these indexes are still double where they were 5 years ago, which is phenomenal. If you bought into the stock market, if you bought a house, if you bought anything 5 years ago and it was worth double now, even if in the meantime it went to the moon and back, that still says something,
Yep.
and there seems to be stability now and resistance from going much lower.
Yep.
I also that was something that stood out to me. The 70s doing better than some. Again, I think you make a great point about it probably didn't blow up as much, so it didn't have as much to come back down. But that was really interesting to me. Um, and those were two of my biggest takeaways. And then the Willie Mays thing, again, even though in the last year, and that's the one I think to watch over the next 6 months
Yep.
because it's 3x where it started, and everything else is pretty much two x where it started. Is it still going down? Is it still coming back to about that 2x level where everything else settled at? And
Hmm.
is that why it's still come down? Is that why it's come down a third in value over the last year? So I
Yeah.
think Willie Mays is one to watch. If someone were to say, pick somebody that you think could continue to be dropping, I think that that's one because he rose so high that
Yeah.
he still might have more room to come down to find that resistance level.
Which is interesting because not to plug one of my own videos, but I did a video shortly after Willie Mays passed away, and my general question was, and I had a little bit of data, but not too much. You know, was the hobby going to see a bump up like you normally see when a Hall of Famer passes away? Um, and I wasn't too convinced. Again, I haven't had a chance to analyze the data over the last, say, month and a half or so, and we'll see maybe on a longer term 6 months if we can see something either a straightening or leveling off from that decline, further decline, or maybe a sort of a V little bump up. I I don't just it's a gut feeling. I just don't see that Willie Mays cards was going to have a significant bump, and we'll see what the data shows.
I don't either. I think it's sort of like, do we think Ichiro will have a long-term bump when he makes the Hall of
Yeah.
Fame? No, because we all know he's going to make the Hall of Fame. That is already built into the price.
Yeah.
We knew Willie Mays was in his 90s. So I think a lot of that was already built into the price.
Hmm.
In the early 2000s, one of the ways I was funding my card habit is I was flipping some soccer cards. Soccer got really big, and I was buying a lot of the young guys raw. I was grading them, I was selling them, and I was making a lot of money and then buying stuff that I liked with it.
Yeah.
And a lot of people were saying, just wait till the World Cup, just wait till the World Cup. And I sold most of my stuff in the summer before the World Cup that year, but I held back some of the players that I thought were on teams that really had a chance to do well. I
Yep.
held back a few thinking that that was possible. But what happened was everybody was waiting in the bushes. And as soon as the World Cup hit, the market got absolutely flooded. And
Yep.
cards not only didn't go up, they went way down
Yeah.
because the market was flooded. And I
Yep.
think there's a fair amount of people that have held back some Maze cards waiting. And I
Yep.
think that the market maybe has gotten flooded, and it's possible, that not only does it stay flat over the next few months, that it maybe even dips a little bit.
Yeah. And I think there were a couple comments from that video that I did is, oh, why I've seen a lot more listings on eBay. So that means that the price, like, well, no, if you have more of a supply hitting the market because everyone is trying to cash in, but there's no equal or greater demand. If the demand is the same, because, well, hey, I've already picked up the Maze cards the last couple years,
Yeah.
and now there's a flood of people saying that the supply demand just doesn't work as many people may think, and
Yeah.
you flood the market like you said. It may actually lead to prices going down a little bit for Maze as opposed to a other player that may get a bump.
I think there was probably more activity, like when you look at the stock market, the volume, how many are selling it. I think the volume of Willie Mays probably went up quite a bit
Mhm.
over about that 4 or 5 day period. But I have a feeling that the price maybe went like that, but then I think it probably went
Yep.
right back or even lower.
Yeah, yeah. But like I said, maybe we'll see in 6 months what that Willie Mays index it looks like. So, Greg, this was an absolute great conversation. I'm so glad you were willing to come on, take a look at this, dive deep into the data. I thought you would enjoyed it, and it seems like you really did. Really appreciate your thoughts and comments and insight. I look at the data, and if you can tell, you looked at the data and I looked at the data, and we each found different things or possibilities of, well, it may be because of this or maybe because of that. And I don't think either one of us may be right or wrong. And for those that are still watching after maybe an hour and 15 minutes, really appreciate it. But would love to know in the comments what are some of your thoughts? Do you agree with uh, our comments? Do you have some other thoughts on why you see some of these indexes going up or down, or periods of being flat? So again, Greg, wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for being on. And with that, everyone, that's all we have for you. So as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, guys.